All right, so today we're going to talk about the Flint water crisis, and I'm essentially going to give you all the background information you need to understand what was taking place in Flint when there was an increased levels of lead in the drinking water. Now, the time period we're looking at here is in about 2014, 2015. So that's just keep that in mind. Um, Hearing about Flint in the news started a little bit later in that time period, 2015 and later, and there's still news stories popping up all the time about what's going on in Flint and charging people with crimes and things like that. Okay, so for those of you who don't know, Flint is located northwest of Detroit in Michigan. And so here's this red dot represents Flint. Here's Detroit. Lake Huron is here. Down here is Ohio. And so just want to give you a sense of where we are geographically. This is a map of Flint, and you can see where some of the water utility buildings are in Flint, um, just to give you a sense. So here's the City of Flint water plant. Here's a General Motors plant. So General Motors has been based in Flint for many years. With used to be a huge industry in Flint. It has since dwindled a little bit, but they still have some operations there. So I do want to let you all know that most of the information that I'm providing for you today comes from this book titled The Poison City, Flint's Water and the American Urban Tragedy by Anna Clark. It's a great book. You want to pick it up. I think it's a decent read. Maybe even an audiobook would be good. Okay, so um, Flint had been, let's start with the sort of water systems in Flint. So, yes, Flint has many water pipes that are made of lead. And that's true in many cities in the US, and including, this is not this is a thing that still exists. We still use lead pipes for getting water to our homes and businesses. And the reason being is that they're they don't oxidize, they don't corrode very easily, and they're a bit flexible, so it makes them easy to install and things like that. Now, newer buildings are not using lead pipes; they're most likely using PVC pipes. But I just want to be clear that the fact that the city of Flint, had lead pipes is not unusual. That is in fact quite usual. Um, okay, so let's look at some of the important people who are going to play a role here in the Flint water crisis. Um, so Flint had been getting its water from Detroit, the Detroit Water and Sewer Department, for about 50 years. So that water came from Lake Huron. The Great Lakes, other than maybe Lake Erie, actually have very clean water. The deeper the lakes, the cleaner the water. And Lake Erie is not so deep. So, but it's very nice water. So Detroit was using water from Lake Huron, and then Flint was purchasing water from Detroit, and they were basically pumping that into the Flint area. Uh, Unfortunately, that water was very expensive, and as the population of Flint decreased, because part of the reason was because the General Motors plant was laying off more and more workers, uh, the cost of the water began to rise for those who still lived in Flint. So it was basically the cost of the water did not decrease, but the population did. And so those fewer people had to pay a greater amount. And it's not like the people who lived in Flint had a great deal of money. 42% of Flint residents live below the federal poverty line. So that's a big chunk of people. So Jeff Wright is this man here. He was and still is the county drain commissioner. So basically, he's in charge of water management issues. He developed a plan to move away from the Detroit Water and Sewer Department to basically try to save the city and the Flint residents money on water. So he developed the Carignan Water Authority, KWA. And so initially, the idea was just to be able to negotiate better rates from uh, Detroit. Uh, and it turns out that they ended up going beyond that. But the idea for the Carignan Water Authority, KWA, began in about 2010. In 2013, the KWA obtained a permit from the Michigan Department of Environmental Quality, which we will talk about a bit here. Um, they've obtained a permit to pull water from the Great Lakes. So basically, the water authority, the Carignan Water Authority that Jeff Wright proposed, was going to be a workaround to get water from Lake Huron, but avoid using Detroit's water and paying Detroit's prices. Darnell Early, was the emergency manager in Flint. So, what's an emergency manager? Um, Basically, when a city or governmental body or agency is in financial trouble, you can bring in an emergency manager. They are not elected officials, but they have a significant amount of power. So he was in charge of getting the finances in order. He was not elected, and he didn't have to worry about being elected. So he essentially could do what he thought needed to be done to get Flint's finances in order. The mayor at the time was Dane Walling, and he, let's see, he and the city council basically had no real political power, even though they were elected officials, because of the fact that Flint was under emergency management. Uh, Now, to be fair, Darnell Early did ask Dane Walling and the city council what they thought of the idea to switch to the KWA, and they all thought it was a great idea, and so they approved the switch. A little note here on emergency management. So by 2017, 52% of the Black residents in Michigan and 16% of Latinos lived in cities under emergency management with unelected officials. Okay? And only 2% of white people fall into that category. So in regions where it's a majority white, uh, then those people are electing officials and they actually have the power. So what the idea here that I want to point out is that there is some inherent bias in the appointing of emergency management, a little bit of inequity. Okay, done with the sign note. So even though everything was approved to switch to the KWA, building the infrastructure hadn't actually begun. And the KWA was actually going to cover more areas than just Flint, a couple other communities as well. And what those communities decided to do was to wait until a appropriate treatment plant was built to actually then use KWA water from Lake Huron. Flint, however, had an old water treatment plant. It needed some upgrades. but could be switched on during the transition from the Detroit Water to the Carignan Water Authority. That transition was planned to take about 2 years. And so, in the meantime, Flint used its water treatment plant and drew water from the Flint River uh, and was basically no longer using the Detroit water. So here we have a couple of images of the actual, from taken during the actual switch. Uh, so here's the pushing of the button, and I believe that's Dane Walling, pushing the button to switch on the Flint water treatment plant and now start using water from the Flint River. And this is an image of the Flint River. Here's everyone excited. They're using the new water, raising a glass, and then taking a swig. So everyone had a very positive outlook. Okay. So within a few months, the first water quality tests came back from the Michigan Department of Environmental Quality, MDEQ. And what they found were some high levels of chlorine and bacteria, but the levels were not high enough to violate legal standards. So they had it, and they had a couple of complaints about the water quality, and mostly they accounted that to the fact that the Flint River has harder water than Lake Huron, and so soap didn't make as many suds and things like that. So water hardness refers to the amount of calcium and magnesium ions present in the water. Water that's considered hard has more of those ions. Those ions interfere with soap's ability to actually make suds. And so, MDEQ thought, oh, everything's fine. All of the measurements that we're taking on our water are within legal limits, so you all don't need to worry. One of the first residents to make a complaint was Bethany Hazard, and this is a picture of her. Uh, she noted that the water was murky and foamy and quote unquote just weird. Another resident, Lathan Jefferson, called the EPA and within weeks of the switch to complain about rashes on his skin that he said came from the water. Unfortunately for everyone, the lab results that the MDEQ was obtaining said that the water was safe. So no one did anything to look into the problem beyond that. On June 2nd, 2014, an NBC news station in Flint said that within 5 weeks of the switch to Flint River water, people had started purchasing bottled water and were no longer drinking the water from their taps. However, the city of Flint maintained that the water was still perfectly fine. Now, one of the things was that no corrosion control was being used in the water. The MDEQ said that it wasn't necessary, but this actually breaks federal law. So cities are required to use corrosion control when they are supplying water to a city or town. And it's unclear if Flint didn't know, it's unclear if Flint knew that they were breaking the law or if they just did not understand what was going on or what they needed to do. And I do want to point out here that I mentioned Bethany Hazard and Lathan Jefferson who made formal complaints about the water. There were many people who were complaining about the water. There was a woman who literally pulled down her pants at a city council meeting and showed that she had a rash on her butt from the water. There were many pastors who were aware of the situation and making complaints and helping out the citizens. One of them specifically was R. Sherman McCaffrey. There were activist groups who were aware of the situation and trying to make changes. And even the University of Michigan in Flint noticed some changes with the water. We'll get into a few more of these details. So let's talk a little bit more about the corrosion control. So what corrosion control does is it prevents the lead pipes from disintegrating, from corroding. And the corrosion control chemical is actually orthophosphates. And while you may not have heard of the term orthophosphates before, you probably have seen H3PO4, H2PO4, HPO4, and all of the ions with phosphoric acid. That's essentially what orthophosphates are. Okay. And when you add these orthophosphates, and it's small amounts, but when you add these to the water, they form a protective film around the inside of the lead pipes that prevents actual contact between the water and then the lead on the pipe itself. And that helps prevent corrosion, and it prevents lead from getting into the water, the drinking water. The Flint River had high level of chlorides in it. That can lead to more corrosion of the water pipes as well, the lead pipes. So we're not going to get into all the details of the chemical equilibria right at this point, but that is something that we will be exploring here in the future. People would notice that when fire hydrants would be opened, the water would come out brown. And the city claimed that the water was brown because of the change in the water source, or maybe there was a water main break, or just because of routine maintenance. And they claimed that everything was within the limits of normal. People's concerns were ignored. And not only did the Flint officials say that everything was normal, the MDEQ, Michigan Department of Environmental Quality, also said that everything was within normal. So there's a couple layers of governing bodies here who are basically ignoring some of the concerns of the Flint residents. Now it turns out that the discoloration of the tap water was not equal with all of the neighborhoods in Flint. It was more discolored in some neighborhoods compared to others. And of course, poorer neighborhoods tended to be more affected than those in wealthier neighborhoods. And the poorer neighborhoods tended to be Black neighborhoods, or people, had people of color in majority. So it's important to note how neighborhoods became segregated. And it's basically through a process called redlining, where it was essentially law that required, basically led to the segregation. Land deeds were written to restrict races. Realtors weren't permitted to show houses to certain people. And Black people had a harder time than white people getting a mortgage. So there were, again, a lot of instances that did and still do play into the segregation that we see in our society within the US. Okay, so then in 2014, General Motors had to switch back to using water that came from Lake Huron. So they started paying another township for their water because the water from Flint was causing corrosion on their engine parts. So they noticed a significant change in the water quality that led to problems on their manufacturing. At that point, Governor Rick Snyder suggested that all of Flint go back to using the Lake Huron water through the Detroit Water Authority. But that didn't happen. In January of 2015, protests about the water had been going on. So the switch to Flint water occurred in April of 2014. There have been lots of complaints throughout the rest of 2014. And then in January, protests began. This image here is from one of the city council meetings. that occurred in January 2015. Did I say this was Bethany HannaAttisha? I apologize. This is Leanne Walters. She brought brown water to the city council meeting, and she was told by the new emergency manager. So Darnell Early left. A new emergency manager came in. His name is Jerry Ambrose. This is a picture of the back of Jerry Ambrose. And he said to her, "That's not your water." So he did not believe at all that the water that Leanne brought into the city council meeting came from her tap. Leanne's family was experiencing rashes and hair loss and had some other serious health concerns. At that time, the MDEQ found that the water had trihalomethanes in it. So trihalomethanes are a byproduct of chlorination. So what you basically end up forming chlorinated species in the water because of excess chlorine added to disinfect the water. And they ended up getting that under control relatively quickly. Uh, there was a city councilman named Eric Mays. He wanted to switch back to the Detroit water. He was believing that all of the complaints from the people in Flint, he didn't question, whether this was their water. He thought that, they were being truthful and was concerned. But it was deemed too expensive to switch back to Detroit water because they would still have to pay for the KWA. And it would end up costing the city of Flint millions of dollars. So the city of Flint ended up offering free water tests to the people in the city. And so residents could send in their water, have it tested for lead and other contaminants in it. The state of Michigan at this point, this was early 2015, they ended up installing water coolers in their Flint offices because the people who worked there refused to drink the tap water. So that's the state people. Okay. Yet the city of Michigan still claimed that the water was drinkable and totally fine. And tests showed that the water was safe when it left the water treatment plant. But when water leaves a water treatment plant, it goes through a series of pipes, water mains, to get to the pipes that lead to people's houses. And those pipes contain lead. Okay. So in February, Leanne again attends a city council meeting, and she shows a video of her son's legs, which are covered in rashes, or on his skin. And then in February of 2015, also, this is when the University of Michigan in Flint found high levels of lead in the drinking water from some of the water fountains in its buildings. So probably a class similar to ours, or someone else who has access to instrumentation was able to grab samples of water from the drinking fountains and test for levels of lead. And they found elevated lead levels. Okay, so then we get to March 2015. The city council voted to switch back to the Detroit Water and Sewer Department. But the emergency manager, who was in control, and that was again Jerry Ambrose, said that no, they could not do that. And then at that point, lots of residents were started organizing and things started to get a bit more heated. Activist groups were forming, and churches were passing out water. And you can see videos of the lines of people in their cars driving up to churches to collect their bottles of water for the week. So Leanne ended up having her water tested, and they found high levels of iron, and that's what's making the water look brown here in this picture. Um, they also they also found very high levels of lead. Some of her water, um, the water that they tested at that time, contained 104 parts per billion of lead. The action level, so the EPA action level is 15 parts per billion. So this was almost 10 times as much as the action level. So this is very significant. Okay. So what Leanne ended up doing was calling the EPA, and she spoke to a man named Miguel del Toro. Here he is. And he connected her with Mark Edwards. And Mark Edwards, he is a professor at Virginia Tech and works in the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering. He basically ends up testing the water for many residents in Flint. So Miguel del Toro contacted the MDEQ, and he asked them if they were using corrosion control. And a man from the MDEQ named Stephen Bush said that yes, they were, and that Leanne's problem was her plumbing. It turns out that Leanne's family had installed pipes in their home a few years earlier, brand new pipes, and those pipes were made from PVC. So they did not have lead pipes. So Stephen Bush's excuse that the problem was the plumbing is not real. It couldn't possibly be that. The city then ended up replacing the service line to Leanne Walters' house, and they wanted her to sign an agreement that the city was no longer responsible for any ill effects that the water caused, and she refused to do so. Then one of her children tested for high blood lead levels. At one point, the city did measure the lead in the drinking water at the Walters home and found 707 parts per billion of lead. The city ended up turning off the water, but you need water in your house to function. So what the Walters ended up doing was taking a garden hose, attaching it to their neighbor's house, and their neighbors ended up sharing the water with them. So they were able to get water into their house using a garden hose. Imagine this. So we're now in April 2015. This is a year later. Okay. Mark Edwards instructed Leanne on how to collect water samples from her home the appropriate way. There are certain standards for collecting water that the EPA puts out. There's a very specific protocol for lead and copper. It's called the lead and copper rule put out by the EPA. And so Mark explained the protocol to her. She ended up collecting 30 samples from her home, 30 samples of water. And so this was before they had turned off the water. And the results showed a range of 300 to 13,000 parts per billion of lead. And so in average, the average was 2,000 parts per billion. The EPA, okay, says that water containing 5,000 parts per billion is considered toxic waste. She wasn't far off from that. Some of those water samples would have to be taken care of as toxic waste and disposed of as toxic waste. And so there would be a huge protocol for that. And Mark stated that it was the worst lead and water contamination he'd seen in his 25 years of doing what he was doing. So he has actually tested water before for different cities, including Washington, D.C. Del Toro wrote a very damning report It stated that the MDEQ did not use corrosion control. He stated that the city's protocol for water tests were unreliable because they used pre-flushing. So this is where you flush water out of the pipes for a given amount of time, and it helps to minimize the lead. Um, he sent this report to Leanne Walters and to Mark Edwards. Leanne ended up sending that to Reporter. That report was a draft and hadn't been signed off by the EPA. And he was actually removed, Miguel de Toro was actually removed from the Flint district office. And this is kind of why that happened, because this report was just a draft and got sent to the media. But anyway, Del Toro ended up saying, and I quote, "I understand that this is not a comfortable situation, but the state is complicit in this, and the public has a right to know what they are doing, because it is their children that are being harmed. At a minimum, the city should be warning residents about high lead, not hiding it, telling them that there is no lead in the water. To me, that borders on criminal neglect." I said he was removed from his office. Even in April, the city of Flint was still insisting that the water was drinkable. It was completely fine. Finally, in July of 2015, even with pre-flushing, the Flint water showed elevated lead levels. And this is actually, this seems hopeful, but it actually gets a little worse. There were 2 outliers in the data, and they were removed. Okay. One of those outliers was Leanne's house. And that was removed because, quote unquote, it did not meet sample criteria. Leanne had installed a filter at her house. In fact, she had removed the filter when they did the water collection. So it should have been a valid collection, a valid sample. And the second sample was disqualified because it didn't come from a single family residence. So with these samples, okay, removing these 2, the lead concentration was 11 parts per billion, okay, which is below the 15 parts per billion EPA action limit. With those 2 samples, the lead concentration was above the action limit. So you do a little bit of data manipulation and you end up with no problem. In that summer, 2015, Mark Edwards got some money from the National Science Foundation Emergency Stipend. He used that money to pay for undergraduate students, graduate students, and a postdoc to run tests on the Flint water using inductively coupled plasma mass spectrometry. This technique allows you to analyze lead, not only lead, but pretty much any metal, heavy metal, or any element with some limitations. And it's very fast. You can do all of the elemental analysis at once. And it's very has very low limits of detection. So you can measure down to parts per billion. There are other instruments where we measure metal concentrations, such as atomic absorption. And they don't measure at such a low limit of detection. So ICP-MS is typically used for measuring lead levels. So Mark Edwards ended up forming the Flint Water Study Group, and they sent 300 sample kits to the residents of Flint, Michigan. They expected to get about 100 of those sample kits back. They ended up getting 277 of those samples back. That's pretty amazing. So clearly the people in Flint were concerned. What they found was that the average lead concentration from the water samples taken from people's homes with no pre-flushing following the EPA copper and lead rule was 27 parts per billion. So that's above, of course, the 15 parts per billion EPA action limit. They found very little chlorine because it had reacted with high concentrations of iron. So, because the pipes were corroding, not only do they contain lead, but they contain iron. This negated the reaction of the chlorine with the iron, negated the disinfectant properties of chlorine. And without that chlorine to disinfect the water, bacteria can survive. We're talking about the lead problem in the Flint water. But there was another huge problem too, and that was Legionnaires and E. coli. But Legionnaires can be much more fatal than E. coli. And there is a documentary, I believe it's a PBS Frontline episode about um, the Flint water crisis, focusing on the effect of Legionnaires. People died from this, from Legionnaires. People died from lead as well, but this was a multi-level problem, I guess. So the city ended up adding more chlorine to the water to help disinfect. That results in the trihalomethanes. You can't drink water that has excess trihalomethanes. It is not good for you. It is also a contaminant. It's very toxic. You also can't boil water to get rid of the trihalomethanes. So there's lots of layers of problems. In September of 2015, Mark Edwards reported that an estimated 5,000 Flint homes had elevated lead. He told residents not to drink the water. The MDEQ, so the Michigan Department of Environmental Quality, stated that the Virginia Tech team were outsiders who arrived in town and proved the theory they set out to prove. And so one of the people at the MDEQ, Brad Wordful, denied that Flint had elevated lead levels in the drinking water. Then Mona HannaAttisha, and you may have heard about her if you've done any looking into what's going on in Flint. She was a pediatrician who studied Flint blood lead level data collected from babies when they're born. She studied what was going on in the county that Flint lies in, which is Genesee County. She found that high blood lead levels in babies was rising, and that the fact it had actually doubled, and she advised the community to avoid the tap water. Brad Wordful from the MDEQ stated that he called her claims unfortunate and said that she was trying to spread hysteria. I think I have a picture here. Yeah, so here's Mona HannaAttisha. She has also written a book on what happened in Flint, What the Eyes Don't See, Story of Crisis, Resistance, and Hope in an American City. Here's Brad Wordful from the MDEQ. And he again said that Mona HannaAttisha was trying to cause hysteria. On October 1st, the state reevaluated their blood lead level data. So the state did a separate evaluation from what Mona HannaAttisha had done. And they found that Dr. Attisha was correct. The Genesee County Commissioners declared a public health emergency in October 1st, 2015. And the Flint City Hall told people to stop drinking their tap water. So we started this switch in April 2014. People started complaining just weeks afterwards. And it takes until October 1st for the concerns of the community to be heard and for people to take the problem and look at it in a serious way. On October 8th, 2015, Flint reconnected to the Detroit water system. And then a new mayor ends up being elected. And then the January of the next year, January 2016, the county declared a Flint water emergency. And then on January 5th, the state declared an emergency in Flint. it took a long time to get um, the state to declare an emergency. They claimed that the county had to declare an emergency first, uh, but this is a topic that has led to uh, the part of the reason why it is believed that there's neglect in this case. So in 2016, the Michigan Attorney General opened a criminal investigation into the crisis. In 2016, Stephen Bush and Mike Frisbee, both from MDEQ, faced charges of misconduct, neglect of duty, tampering with evidence, and in violation of the Michigan Safe Drinking Water Act. Um, 6 state employees were charged with crimes. Um, Darnell Early and Jerry Ambrose were charged with obstructing in the investigation and involuntary manslaughter. Um, and there were, in fact, there's a new article out talking about how um, the governor, Rick, what's his last name? Totally blanking. The governor of Michigan at the time is being charged with a misdemeanor as well. This happened just recently. The city of Flint is now replacing all of the lead pipes, and that's an ongoing process. They're going to stick with the Detroit water at this point, and that is essentially where we are. So yeah, that is the story of what happened in Flint, and there's lots of uh, problems associated with what went on. Um, Clearly, the people in power were not listening to the residents. And I think we need to consider the importance of that science played in this. I mean, clearly, uh, that is what ended up uh, getting to the root of the problem. Looking at blood lead levels and the levels of lead in the drinking water. So, you know, us as scientists, as chemists, we do hold some sort of uh, um, we have an important role in society, and whether it be translating technical information into something that anyone can understand, or whether it be taking measurements and explaining what those measurements mean to the public. And so that's some of the takeaways that I want you to see with what's happening here in Flint and how it applies to you.